guys, today we're talking about how you can improve your sci-fi writing and my best tips on how to break into the dauntingness that is that genre. As you guys know, I'm currently in the throngs of writing a sci-fi. I've been writing it for 3 years, and I've written a couple others before that, but specifically mine is a space opera that I am in right now, and I would argue to say that it's probably one of the hardest subcategories of sci-fi to write, but we will break all into that right now. So my number one tip when it comes to sci-fi is that sci-fi should have some science in it. There should be some science in your sci-fi. That's why it's the sci in sci-fi. Science, actual real life science, science that is actually in existence, or science that you can make up to, but that is based on actual science. That means, yes, you unfortunately do have to do research. So if you don't like to do research, if you don't like to do world building, I would think that maybe sci-fi is not the genre you should get into, or you should find a way to love it, because god, you're gonna have to do so much work. It's not an easy one, and it's something to brace yourself for, but it should have science in it. The only exception I have to this is if you're writing a space story and not a actual sci-fi. So a space story is basically science fiction, is what they usually call it, just because it takes place in space. However, it's just a fantasy that takes place in space. Examples of this are Star Wars and the Saga series graphic novels. A lot of people don't realize that Star Wars is indeed just a fantasy in space, but I mean, if you compare that side by side with Star Trek, Star Trek actually tries to like go into the science of things, and it's just, you know, stop talking nerd to me. Can you say that in a way that I understand, as in essence. Sometimes the science is just completely made up, but they at least try to base it in science. Meanwhile, in Star Wars, it is just the magical force. Like, it's just magic. It's magic in space. There's no science. They don't even try to explain it with science. There's no scientific way to explain it in their world. So it's a fantasy in space, and those are completely different things. So if you're writing a fantasy in space, which I would argue to say is an oversaturated market because it's just people who want to write sci-fi without actually doing any research, then that might be more for you. But I'm saying, if you have like the story of your heart is set in space, but you don't want to do research and you suck at it, then I would just make a fantasy in space. Because if you just hate it that much, but you really want to do it, then go ahead. Everyone else seems to anyways. But for everybody else, you should have science. It's simple, but no one does it. My second tip is to avoid the info dumps. This is something that's really hard to do, especially when you're writing something that has a lot of different moving pieces to it, a lot of world that is developed before the reader actually jumps into the page or before the story starts. Try to avoid info dumps. This means I would try your hardest as well to avoid a prologue. I myself love prologues. My book originally had a prologue and it ended up serving no purpose. It was just a way to slyly introduce a scientific concept without having to info dump. But info dump in your first couple drafts because it's going to be the easiest for you, but slowly you're going to have to weed out the info dumping and figure out a way to naturally weave in details. My easiest way to do that is if you're going to introduce a scientific element or some part of the world building or something else, do it through prose, because then it's beautiful and people want to read it, versus if it sounds like a textbook. Just try to avoid dumping a lot of the world building, a lot of the research, and all this other stuff into it, because no one wants to read it when it's like that. Number 3, understand that people will be reading your book who know nothing about science. You're going to do all this research, or you already have some research in mind, and you think everybody knows it, but no, not everyone knows that there is no sound in space. That's something that usually when we see it in like Star Wars and everything like that, that pew pew pew, it's just ingrained in our minds that, oh, if there's an explosion, there will be fire and there will be all this noise and everything, and it's like, no, space fighting doesn't actually have any of those noises, and there's no fire outside of the space station, really. I mean, with escaping oxygen, there could be, but like, there's not going to be an actual gigantic explosion, because there's no oxygen in space. Fire needs oxygen to survive, and there's not gonna be any noise. But some people aren't gonna know that, and like some writers aren't gonna know that. So just get your basics down with research before you even begin getting into your story, but don't spend the whole time preparing to write the story by researching and then never actually writing the story. You should definitely just do baseline research. So for example, if you're doing a space story, learn those little nuggets of information, look up like top 10 mistakes sci-fi writers make or something like that, and it'll usually pop up with a list of things like that that you can make sure that you avoid. But then after that, I would suggest just doing your research when you need to know it or when you know it's coming up in your story versus spending all your time doing it or doing all your research in one go. You're gonna get pooped out. It's better to just spread it out. But yeah, understand that some people aren't going to know that, so you're gonna have to explain some basic science, and it's gonna be basic to you, but it's not gonna be basic to everyone. But then again, the best way to do this is through prose. So for example, there's a movie or a horror movie out there and it's like there's no sound or it's like you can't hear their scream in space or something like that. That's like a cool way to like be like there's no sound in space. So for everyone who's confused, there's no sound. Like it tells you all you need to know. So finding ways to implement that into daily conversation or into the prose, basic science stuff like that, that needs to be known for the story to make sense. Try to fit it in like that and not like a textbook. Number 4 is what I've been saying along, is that try to use prose, daily conversations, and other things like that to weave in otherwise tedious facts, science bits, or world building. Because, guys, you may love to research, you may love to world build, or you may hate both of them, but you did a lot of it anyways, but your readers don't want to fucking hear about it. They don't. I'm sorry, like, I love my world, but I keep my infodumpy kind of things, or the very tedious details of the science, the world building, the families, the ship names, all these other things. I'm putting those all up on my website for my book, not inside the book. So everyone who falls in love with the world and wants to know more has a place to get all the information that I got in my brain that never ended up in the pages online, and they can access it. But it shouldn't be just all in the book. Like, if you did a bunch of research on something cool, you know more, it's good to have that context for yourself, but it doesn't always need to be in the book. Sometimes you think it will need to be, and it turns out it doesn't, and that's just a whole nother thing you have to deal with. It really sucks, but the best idea to do with all that information is to put it on a website. Because I think for most people, their books shouldn't have a website, but then when it comes to like high fantasy or high concept sci-fi, they should definitely have like probably a website of their own or an entire page or more dedicated on your website for it, especially if it's in terms of a series, because then you're trying to get people to stay interested in it for a long course of many years. You know, years in between you might not have a book, there might be several months where there's not a book out, but there's content on your website. It's also a good place to go and put out like short stories and novellas that maybe your publisher doesn't put out, or it's too short for you to self-publish yourself. I personally think for fantasies and for sci-fis, best place to put it is either like on an Instagram you have dedicated to it, on a website, or on both, something like that, but not in the pages. It doesn't belong there. I'm sorry, but no one cares about the detailed family tree you did. Goes back 7 generations. No one cares. Not until they actually love the book, but first they have to love the book to give a shit about it. Number 5, decide early on what kind of sci-fi you are writing. Are you writing dystopian? Are you writing more contemporary with one scientific element? For example, like the TV show Stitchers. Are you writing more of space opera? Are you writing more of a fantasy that takes place in space? And if you're writing more of a space opera, do they go to different planets, or are they like The Expanse where they more so stay in the same solar system? Also, if it's not like The Expanse, are there aliens? If they go to other worlds, are there aliens? How do they interact with these aliens? What is the relationship between them and aliens? I just want more stories with aliens. It's a thing. Decide what kind of sci-fi you are writing, and be honest with yourself. If you are someone who wants to be writing some huge concept sci-fi where they go to multiple planets and there's a bunch of aliens and stuff, and you want to be taken seriously, don't do a fantasy in space where there's just like a giant egg that's a planet that's like gonna crack open and like release a like Falcon space thing. I'm thinking mostly of like Saga and Futurama. Saga and Futurama are definitely fantasies in space, even though a lot of Futurama takes place on Earth, but it's still very fantastical in its not being grounded in reality. I'm sorry, I've been binge watching Futurama and it's so good, but I feel like fantasy in space is taken a lot better when it's put into the context of graphic novels, movies, video games, and TV shows. But when it's in books, not so much. In books, they expect you to have some research element or to be actual like hard sci-fi. I've just noticed that for the most part. The only thing I can think of that kind of breaks through, like Final Fantasy, for example, is more fantasy, sci-fi blend, versus like Mass Effect is actually a video game that's quite based on actual science, and nothing like too crazy happens in it that couldn't actually happen, which is kind of scary when you think about it. So that's more a grounded in reality sci-fi versus a fantasy in space. But decide early on, because you don't want to write one thing thinking you're writing something else, and then it turns out you were wrong. Number 6, if you hate world building and research, consider a different genre to write, because you're going to do a lot of it and only like 10 to 20% of it is ever actually gonna be in the book, and then you'll like get an agent and they'll cut like another 10% out of it. Like, you're gonna have to do a lot just for yourself. And that's the thing too, is that you're like, well, why do I have to do all this researching world building if none of it's gonna end up being in the book? And that's because for you and for your context, because let's say you write one thing in book 1 of your series, but in book 3 you say something that completely counteracts book 1's thing. You didn't do any world building, you didn't set the foundation of anything, you didn't give yourself context, and you forgot details that are very important like that. I hate when I'm reading that, because for me, I remember those things. Not everyone does, some people will not even pay attention, but for me, I notice. I notice a lot. I'm trying to think of something, for example, especially when it comes to foreshadowing. I love foreshadowing elements. So, for example, let's go back to Mass Effect, because it's one of my favorites. There is a part in Mass Effect 2 when you go and get one of your friends from the first game. Her name is Tali, and she's on a planet that sun is slowly pretty rapidly expanding, and it's ruining the planet. You go in the sun and you get burned and your like health meter goes psh, right? And that was a huge moment. It was really important because that was like her species' home planet. It's overrun by their enemies, and it sets up a lot of foreshadowing for important things in the third game, except for they changed writers before they got to the third game, and so nothing ever happened with that. They risked their lives for absolutely nothing, and some fans didn't even notice. I noticed. I was like, hey, what happened to that exploding star? Like, that was important. That was a very important scene, and the original writers had plans for it, and the other writers didn't know what it was, so they just let it die. Some fans notice, some don't, but that's why it's important to stay consistent and to world build and do your research so that you know what the hell is actually happening behind the scenes, not just what's on the page, because you as the author should know more than what the reader knows, and you know more than what the characters know, but none of you know what each other knows, except for you. You are the god of the universe, and that means you need context, research, and world building. Otherwise, you have no foundation to base anything off of, and trust me, it shows. Like, I don't know why, there's so many times when people will be like, I world build and I planned out my whole series beforehand, but when you read it, you're like, no you didn't, no you didn't. Like, if anyone tells me Sarah J Maas planned anything, like, for example, Throne of Glass, every single one of those books in that series feels like a different book. She's pantsing, and no one can tell me otherwise. Number 7 is to understand the market for sci-fi, and don't get your hopes up too high, because sci-fi is a very hard sell. A lot of people don't even accept sci-fi. A lot of people don't fucking want it. There's tons of people who say that they read everything except for westerns and sci-fi. It is the country of the music industry in essence. Yeah, it's one of those things where like everyone's, I listen to everything except for country. It's like I read everything except for sci-fi. And people are just like that. I think because there's just so much man in sci-fi. And when I say this, I mean there's just a lot of the standard sci-fi. When you think sci-fi, you think of some probably dude in his basement who wrote a really infodumpy thing you don't enjoy that really sexualizes women a lot. There's probably like a half-naked alien on the cover. And no fucking one wants that. Like, that's been the standard for a long time in sci-fi, and I feel like now recently we finally had a break in women going into sci-fi, but it's mostly in the YA area. I have several books on my shelf over there, like literally I put all the sci-fis together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 sci-fis on the shelf just in one section together of ones that I haven't read or I've read partially. And I think all of them are written by women because they're the only ones that interested me. And they're also, I think, all labeled YA or like the new adult that doesn't exist. If you notice, they're less infodumpy. They don't have that. They don't have that sexualization of women. And So it's breaking in slowly. I've been gathering those books, and I'm telling you, I've been in the YA space for a long time, and there have not been many sci-fis published at all. There's been more recently, but there's been no breakthrough to make it like a more popular thing. And I think that's something that you have to be honest with yourself about going into this, because it's something I know I fear, because I know the market, and I know that right now in the last year, 2018 and 2019, this year, there's a lot of sci-fis I know that are coming out, but that just means the market will get oversaturated very fast as soon as people start accepting it. And number 8, the last thing to remember while you're writing sci-fi is to know the dedicated fan base and know what's expected of the specific subcategory that you're working in. So for example, if you're writing a space opera, understand that some fans are still going to think you're going to write a Star Wars. Also understand what Star Trek fans are going to be looking for. I would watch as much and gather as much as you can about your genre as possible. Like, I grew up with it, so it's not that hard for me. I grew up on Stargate SG-1 like crazy. I watched that like every night before bed. I watched it every like Sunday morning. That came my new Sunday like cartoon kind of thing. I absolutely love Star Trek Voyager. I love the new Star Trek movies. 7 is bae. I love Mass Effect. I love sci-fi like so much, and I specifically love things that take place in space. I love things that have to deal with moral difficulties like Star Trek. And even Stargate SG-1 deals with those kinds of things. So I was able to easily understand what people who love the genre are expecting based off of the media that is more popular to consume, like books and like movies and TV shows versus books. But at the same time, you have to understand what the book fan base is expecting as well, and to navigate that, not cater to it necessarily, but to understand what people are going to be expecting, maybe blow their minds when it comes to it, or maybe improve upon it, or maybe cater to it, or maybe ignore it. Do remember to like this video if you did like it. Comment down below what you thought of all of my tips, and if you have any more to add to it. If so, maybe I'll make a part 2. And remember to subscribe, because I make writing and crime related videos every Friday. So bye!
Trying to step back